When a janitor's daughter declared, "I speak 9 languages," to a laughing Arab billionaire in the Grand Aurora Hotel's marble lobby, nobody expected what happened next. The silence that followed would shatter more than just arrogance, it would rewrite the very definition of wealth itself. Stay with me until the end of this incredible story and comment your city so I can see how far this tale has traveled across the world. The marble floor of the Grand Aurora Hotel's lobby gleamed like liquid silver under the cascade of crystal chandeliers, each surface polished to mirror perfection by hands that society had deemed invisible. Among those hands belonged to Daniel Carter, a man whose calloused fingers bore witness to a transformation that life had forced upon him, from celebrated linguistics professor to custodian of other people's dreams. At 42, Daniel moved through the opulent space with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned that survival sometimes meant swallowing pride whole. His maintenance uniform, pressed crisp despite its age, carried the weight of responsibility heavier than any academic regalia he'd once worn. The hotel's guests, oil executives, tech moguls, diplomats flowed around him like water around a stone, their conversations, a symphony of entitlement in languages he understood but could no longer afford to speak professionally. "Papa, you missed a spot," came a voice that could melt winter itself. Emma Carter, 8 years old, and possessing eyes that held galaxies of curiosity, skipped across the marble expanse with the fearless grace of childhood. Her school backpack bounced against her small frame, heavy with books that Daniel scraped together money to buy, each one a brick in the foundation of dreams he was determined to build for her. "Where, little scholar?" Daniel's face softened as he knelt to her eye level, the harsh fluorescent maintenance lights giving way to something warmer in his expression. Emma pointed to a section of floor that sparkled just as brilliantly as every other inch. "There, but I think it's actually perfect. I just wanted you to come down here so I could tell you something." "And what's that?" "Mrs. Rodriguez says I'm getting too smart for my grade again." Emma's voice carried a mixture of pride and worry that no 8-year-old should have to navigate. "She wants to skip me up to 5th grade, but I told her I need to think about it." Daniel's heart performed a complicated dance between joy and terror. Emma's intellectual gifts had been evident since she'd started reading at 3 devouring books in their tiny apartment, like a starving person finally invited to feast. But acceleration meant separation from children her age, meant standing out even more in a world that already saw her as the janitor's kid. "What do you want to do?" he asked, though he already knew. Emma had inherited her mother's brilliant mind, but she'd also inherited Daniel's cautious heart. "I want to stay with kids my age, but I also want to learn everything." Emma's small hands gestured expansively. "Can't I do both?" Before Daniel could answer, a commotion erupted near the hotel's main entrance. A convoy of black luxury vehicles had arrived, their engines purring with the quiet confidence of machines worth more than most people's homes. Uniformed drivers emerged first, followed by security personnel, whose earpieces and sharp eyes marked them as serious professionals. The lobby's atmosphere shifted like air pressure before a storm. Conversations paused mid-sentence, heads turned, and even the hotel staff straightened their already perfect postures. Daniel recognized the signs. Someone truly powerful had arrived, someone whose presence commanded attention, not through volume but through the sheer gravitational pull of wealth and influence. "Papa, what's happening?" Emma whispered, her hand slipping into his as they watched the spectacle unfold. "Someone very important just arrived," Daniel murmured instinctively, pulling Emma slightly behind him. In his years working at the Grand Aurora, he'd learned to read the social weather, and this felt like a hurricane approaching. The hotel's general manager, Evelyn Harper, appeared as if materialized from thin air. A woman in her 50s whose competence was legendary and whose ability to handle the hotel's most demanding guests bordered on superhuman. She moved through the lobby with the practiced grace of someone conducting an invisible orchestra. "Mr. Al Mansour's arrival," she announced quietly to her staff, her voice carrying just far enough to alert those who needed to know. "Full VIP protocol." Daniel's blood chilled. Khalid Al Mansour, he'd heard the name whispered in both reverent and fearful tones throughout the hotel. Oil magnate, real estate emperor, a man whose business decisions could shift entire economies. More importantly for Daniel's immediate concerns, Al Mansour was known for his particular brand of arrogance, the kind that came from never being told no and never being held accountable for the word yes. "Daniel." Evelyn appeared beside them, her expression apologetic but firm. "I need you to finish the East Wing tonight. Mr. Al Mansour's team has specific requirements for tomorrow's meetings." "Of course, ma'am." Daniel nodded, already calculating how long it would take and whether Emma could wait in the staff break room doing homework. "I'll get started right away." "Papa," Emma tugged on his sleeve as Evelyn moved away to orchestrate other preparations. "Who is Mr. Al Mansour?" "A very wealthy man who expects everything to be perfect." Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to all new information. "Does being wealthy make you better at expecting things?" The question, innocent as it was, cut straight to the heart of everything Daniel had been trying to protect her from understanding too early. "No, sweetheart. Money doesn't make anyone better at anything except having money." "Then why does everyone act different when wealthy people show up?" Daniel paused his cleaning and looked down at his daughter, this remarkable little person who saw the world with such clarity it sometimes took his breath away. Because sometimes people forget that what makes someone important isn't what they have, but who they are. The main doors swept open with theatrical precision, and Khalid Al Mansour entered the Grand Aurora Hotel like a king returning to his palace. At 58, he moved with the casual confidence of someone who had never questioned his right to occupy any space he chose. His suit, Italian, certainly custom, definitely worth more than Daniel made in 6 months, fit him like liquid silk. Diamond cufflinks caught the light as he gestured, and his shoes clicked against the marble with the rhythm of conquest. But it was his eyes that Daniel noticed most. Cold, calculating, they swept the lobby not with appreciation for its beauty, but with the assessment of someone taking inventory of possessions. When those eyes passed over Daniel and Emma, there was no recognition of their humanity. They were simply part of the furniture fixtures to be noted and forgotten. "Mr. Al Mansour, welcome back to the Grand Aurora." Evelyn materialized beside him with her signature blend of professionalism and warmth. "Your penthouse suite is prepared exactly to your specifications." "Good." His voice carried a slight accent that spoke of privileged international education. "And the security arrangements?" "Complete. Your meetings tomorrow will have absolute privacy." As they spoke, Emma watched the interaction with the intensity of a scholar studying a new language. Daniel could practically see her brilliant mind processing the dynamics, the deference, the unspoken hierarchies, the way power moved through social spaces like invisible electricity. "Papa," she whispered, "he seems sad." Daniel blinked, following Emma's gaze back to Al Mansour. To Daniel's eyes, the man appeared anything but sad, arrogant, entitled, dismissive perhaps, but not sad. But Emma had always possessed an uncanny ability to see beyond surfaces, to detect emotions that others missed entirely. "What makes you think that—" His eyes. "They're angry, but anger is usually sadness wearing a disguise." The observation was so astute, so far beyond her years, that Daniel felt his chest tighten with both pride and worry. Emma's emotional intelligence was as remarkable as her academic gifts, but it also meant she carried burdens that other children never even noticed. As if summoned by their conversation, Al Mansour's attention suddenly fixed on them. Perhaps it was Emma's intent stare, or perhaps it was simply the magnetism that brilliant children seem to possess, but his cold gaze landed on the small girl standing beside the janitor with the force of a spotlight. "Interesting," he murmured loud enough for his entourage to hear. "The help brings children to work now." The words landed in the lobby's refined atmosphere like stones thrown into still water. Conversations faltered, and Daniel felt every eye in the vicinity turn toward them. His protective instincts flared to life, but before he could respond, Emma stepped forward. "I'm not working," she said, with the clear, unafraid voice of someone who had never learned that she should be intimidated by wealth. "I'm waiting for my papa to finish his job so we can go home and practice languages." Al Mansour's eyebrows rose slightly, perhaps surprised that the child had spoken at all. In his world, children were silent ornaments seen but never heard. "Languages, how ambitious." The word dripped with condescension, but Emma either didn't catch it or chose to ignore it entirely. "I speak 9 languages," she announced with the pride of someone sharing their greatest treasure. "My papa taught me that words are bridges between worlds." The silence that followed was electric. Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs as he watched Al Mansour's expression shift from mild interest to something sharper, more dangerous. Around them, hotel guests and staff had gone completely still, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. And then Khalid Al Mansour laughed. It wasn't the warm laughter of delight, or even the polite chuckle of social convention. It was the cold, cutting sound of someone who had just heard the most ridiculous thing imaginable, the laughter of cruelty, dressed as amusement. 9 languages. He repeated, his voice carrying across the marble space like a challenge thrown down before a crowd. "A janitor's daughter speaks 9 languages." The words hit Daniel like physical blows, each syllable designed to strip away dignity and reduce Emma to nothing more than the help's child. But as he stepped forward to shield his daughter from this assault, Emma moved past him with the fearless grace of someone who had never learned that she should be small. "Yes," she said simply, her young voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent lobby. "Would you like me to prove it?" The offer hung in the air like a sword suspended by the thinnest thread. Daniel watched Al Mansour's face cycle through surprise calculation and something that might have been anticipation. Around them, the lobby had become an arena, and Emma, brilliant, brave, impossibly vulnerable Emma, had just stepped into the center ring. "This should be entertaining," Al Mansour said, his voice now loud enough for everyone to hear clearly. "Please, little one, demonstrate these supposed linguistic abilities." What he intended as a public humiliation was about to become something else entirely. But at that moment, as Daniel watched his 8-year-old daughter face down a billionaire with nothing but truth and courage, he realized that Emma had inherited more than just her mother's intellect. She had also inherited something infinitely more dangerous to men like Khalid Al Mansour. She had inherited the absolute fearlessness that came from knowing without doubt exactly who she was. The battle was about to begin. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt something he had almost forgotten how to feel: hope. Because Emma Carter, daughter of a janitor, keeper of 9 languages, bridge builder between worlds, was about to teach a billionaire what true wealth actually looked like. The lobby had transformed into something resembling a gladiatorial arena, with Emma Carter standing in the center, like a tiny David facing her Goliath. Khalid Al Mansour's laughter still echoed off the marble walls, but something in Emma's unwavering gaze had already begun to shift the atmosphere from mockery toward something far more electric. "Very well," Al Mansour said, his voice carrying the theatrical tone of someone about to conduct a particularly amusing experiment. He gestured grandly to his entourage, ensuring he had maximum audience for what he clearly expected to be a child's humiliation. "Let's begin with something simple. Arabic, surely a janitor's daughter wouldn't know the language of business and diplomacy." He spoke a rapid sentence in Arabic, his tone deliberately complex and formal. The words flowed with the confidence of someone who had used the language to negotiate billion-dollar deals across the Middle East. Around them, several guests nodded appreciatively at the linguistic sophistication, while others leaned forward, eager to witness what they assumed would be Emma's inevitable failure. Emma listened with the focused attention of a scholar, her head tilted slightly, as she processed not just the words, but their nuances, their emotional undertones, their cultural context. When Al Mansour finished, she smiled not with nervousness, but with the quiet joy of someone who had just been offered the chance to share something beautiful. "أنت تسأل عما إذا كان بإمكان فتاة صغيرة مثلي أن تفهم لغة الأعمال والدبلوماسية، لكنني أعتقد أن اللغة الحقيقية للأعمال ليست العربية أو الإنجليزية، إنها الاحترام." She replied, her pronunciation crisp and her grammar flawless. The translation rippled through the crowd in whispered conversations, but Daniel understood every word. Emma had said, "You ask whether a little girl like me can understand the language of business and diplomacy, but I think the real language of business isn't Arabic or English, it's respect." The silence that followed was profound. Several Arabic speakers in the crowd exchanged glances of genuine surprise, while Al Mansour's confident expression flickered for just a moment. But Emma wasn't finished. "However," she continued in perfect English, "if you prefer classical Arabic, I could recite some verses from Al-Mutanabi, or if you'd like modern Arabic. I know several contemporary poets from Syria and Lebanon whose work speaks to the refugee experience." Al Mansour's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The child had not only answered his challenge, but had demonstrated a depth of knowledge that surpassed mere vocabulary memorization. She understood cultural context, historical significance, and had even offered a subtle critique of his approach. "Impressive," he conceded, though his tone suggested anything but admiration. "But Arabic is common enough in international circles. Let's try something more challenging." He switched to rapid Italian speaking, with the fluency of someone who had conducted business in Milan and Rome for decades. The sentence was longer this time, more complex, filled with subjunctive clauses and formal registers that would challenge even advanced speakers. Emma's response came without hesitation. "Lei ha chiesto se capisco le sfumature degli affari internazionali, ma penso che la vera sfida non sia parlare molte lingue e ricordare che dietro ogni lingua c'è un cuore umano che batte con le stesse speranze e paure, indipendentemente dal conto in banca." This time the murmur from the crowd was audible. Emma had not only understood the complex Italian, but had responded with philosophical depth that left several native speakers nodding in appreciation. She had said, "You asked if I understand the nuances of international business, but I think the real challenge isn't speaking many languages. It's remembering that behind every language is a human heart, beating with the same hopes and fears, regardless of bank account." Daniel felt his chest swell with pride so intense it was almost painful. Emma wasn't just demonstrating linguistic ability. She was offering wisdom that cut straight through Al Mansour's materialistic worldview. "Lucky guesses," Al Mansour muttered, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Let's see how you handle Mandarin Chinese." The language that emerged from his lips was tonal and precise, the Mandarin of someone who had negotiated with Beijing's elite. He spoke of business complexities and cultural superiorities, his words designed to trip up even advanced speakers with their rapid-fire delivery and subtle tonal variations. Emma closed her eyes for just a moment, as if accessing some internal library where languages lived like old friends waiting to be visited. When she opened them and began to speak, the Mandarin that flowed from her 8-year-old lips was like music made manifest. 您谈论商业的复杂性和文化优越性，但我的中文老师告诉我，最美丽的中文词汇不是关于金钱或权力的，是关于家庭友谊和人类精神不可征服的力量。比如“家”这个字，您知道它是如何构成的吗？是由面、房屋和石、猪组成的，提醒我们家不是好话的地方，而是有爱和温暖的地方。The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Several Chinese business executives in the lobby began speaking rapidly among themselves, their voices filled with genuine amazement. Emma had not only responded fluently, but had demonstrated cultural knowledge that went far beyond textbook learning. She had explained that the most beautiful Chinese words weren't about money or power, but about family friendship and the unconquerable strength of the human spirit. She had even broken down the etymology of the character for home, explaining how it was composed of roof and pig, reminding everyone that home wasn't a luxurious place but a place with love and warmth. Al Mansour's face had gone pale beneath his carefully maintained tan. The child wasn't just answering his challenges, she was dismantling his entire worldview with each response. Japanese, he said tersely. His earlier theatrical presentation replaced by something that sounded almost desperate. Surely you cannot master the honorific complexities of Japanese. The Japanese that spilled from his lips was formal and intimidating, filled with the kind of respectful language that took most foreigners years to master. He spoke of hierarchy, of knowing one's place, of the importance of respecting those with superior positions in society. Emma's response came in Japanese, so perfectly modulated, so respectful yet confident, that several Japanese guests in the lobby actually bowed slightly in acknowledgement of her skill. ジエチャンとジウェイについて話されましたが、私が日本語で学んだ最も美しい概念はおもてなしです。それは真の有約性は他人を見下すことではなく、すべての人を心から還元することだと教えてくれます。私の負荷は掃除部かもしれませんが、彼は毎日満のおもてなしの精神を実践しています。なぜなら彼は人々を幸せにし、彼らの世界を美しくしているからです。The translation swept through the crowd like wildfire. Emma had spoken of omotenashi, the Japanese concept of wholehearted hospitality, explaining that true superiority wasn't about looking down on others, but about welcoming everyone wholeheartedly. She had said that while her father might be a janitor, he practiced the true spirit of omotenashi every day because he made people happy and made their world beautiful. Daniel felt tears threatening to spill over. Not only was Emma defending him, but she was doing so with such grace and wisdom that she was transforming his perceived weakness into strength. This is impossible. Al Mansour snapped, his composure finally cracking. No child could possibly... Spanish, Emma interrupted gently, her voice still respectful, but now carrying an undertone of quiet confidence that made the entire lobby lean forward in anticipation. French, German, Portuguese, Russian. She looked directly at Al Mansour, her 8-year-old eyes holding depths that seemed to see straight through his wealth to the insecurity beneath. Which would you prefer, or perhaps you'd like to choose languages I haven't mentioned yet? The billionaire's face cycled through a series of emotions, disbelief, anger, and something that might have been fear. This wasn't going according to script. The janitor's daughter was supposed to stumble to fail to provide ammunition for his sense of superiority. Instead, she was demonstrating capabilities that exceeded his own, while simultaneously offering philosophical insights that made his worldview look petty and small. "Russian," he said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "Let's see you handle the complexity of Russian grammar." He launched into a rapid monologue in Russian, speaking of power and weakness of natural hierarchies and the foolishness of those who didn't know their place in the world. His accent was good, but not perfect, the Russian of someone who had learned it for business rather than from the cradle. Emma listened with the same focused attention she had given to all the previous challenges, but this time something different happened. When she began to respond, her Russian carried a warmth and musicality that made it clear she didn't just speak the language, she loved it. «Вы говорите о силе и слабости, о естественных иерархиях, но русский язык научил меня другому слову «душа». Это слово означает душу, но это больше, чем просто дух. Это часть человека, которая остается прекрасной, независимо от того, сколько денег у него в банке или какую работу он выполняет. Мой папа может быть уборщиком, но его душа полна поэзии, знаний и любви. Это делает его богаче любого миллиардера. The Russian speakers in the crowd began murmuring among themselves with obvious excitement. Emma had spoken of dusha, the Russian concept of soul, explaining that it referred to the part of a person that remained beautiful regardless of money or job. She had said that while her father might be a janitor, his soul was full of poetry knowledge and love, making him richer than any billionaire. But Emma wasn't finished. Something had awakened in her, some deeper current of communication that transcended mere linguistic demonstration. She was no longer just answering Al Mansour's challenges. She was using each language to build a bridge of understanding that seemed to encompass everyone in the lobby. "Would you like to hear Polish?" she asked, her voice now carrying a confidence that seemed to fill the entire space. "My mama taught me Polish lullabies before she went to heaven. Or perhaps Portuguese. I've been reading Brazilian poetry that talks about how beauty exists everywhere, if you know how to see it." Al Mansour stood frozen, his earlier arrogance replaced by something approaching shock. Around them, the lobby had become completely silent, except for the distant hum of air conditioning and the soft sound of Emma's voice as she continued. "My papa always tells me that languages are like windows," she said, returning to English, but with her voice carrying traces of all the languages she had just spoken, as if they were colors that had mixed to create something new and beautiful. When you speak someone's language, you can see the world through their window. And when you can see through enough windows, you realize that all the rooms are connected, that we're all living in the same house. The metaphor landed in the silent lobby like a seed in fertile ground. Daniel watched faces around the room as Emma's words took root, saw the shift in expressions, as people began to understand that they were witnessing something far more significant than a linguistic demonstration. "But here's what I don't understand," Emma continued, her young voice now carrying a weight that seemed impossible for her age. She looked directly at Al Mansour, her eyes holding not challenge, but genuine curiosity. "If you speak so many languages too, if you've looked through all those windows, how can you still think that some people are worth more than others?" The question hung in the air like a perfectly struck bell, its resonance seeming to touch every person in the lobby. Al Mansour opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, his face cycling through expressions as if he were trying to remember lines to a play he had forgotten he was performing. He began, then stopped, his usual fluency abandoned in the face of an 8-year-old's moral clarity. Emma waited with the patience of someone who understood that sometimes the most important conversations required silence for truth to emerge. Around them, the lobby remained frozen in anticipation, everyone sensing that they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered and retold for years to come. Finally, Al Mansour seemed to find his voice again, but when he spoke it was with less certainty than before. "You speak well for a child," he conceded, "but speaking languages and understanding the complexities of the real world are very different things." "Maybe," Emma agreed with the grace of someone who had learned that sometimes the best way to win an argument was to acknowledge partial truth. "But I think maybe the real world is only complicated because people make it that way. Like when people decide that having money makes them more important than people who clean floors or teach children or take care of sick people." She paused, tilting her head with the same expression she wore when working through particularly challenging homework problems. "My papa taught me that every job is important because every job helps other people somehow. Your job probably helps people too, doesn't it?" The question was asked with such genuine curiosity, such complete absence of malice that Al Mansour seemed to physically recoil. Here was a child offering him the benefit of the doubt, inviting him to find dignity in his own work, while simultaneously highlighting the dignity he had tried to strip from hers. Yes, I suppose it does," he admitted reluctantly. "Then why does it matter who makes more money?" Emma asked. "Aren't we all just trying to help people and take care of our families?" The simplicity of the question was devastating in its clarity. Daniel watched as Al Mansour struggled visibly with concepts that Emma seemed to understand intuitively, that human worth wasn't measurable in dollars, that dignity didn't come from bank accounts, that true sophistication might actually be found in the ability to see beauty and value in every person. Around them, the lobby had become a classroom, where an 8-year-old teacher was offering lessons in humanity to adults who had forgotten what they once knew. Hotel guests found themselves reconsidering assumptions they hadn't questioned in years. Staff members stood straighter, suddenly aware that the child saw their work as valuable and necessary. Emma looked around the room, her gaze touching each face with the warmth of someone who genuinely saw every person as worthy of respect and consideration. When her eyes returned to Al Mansour, they held no triumph, no smugness, only the hope that he might see what she saw. "I think," she said softly, "that if everyone could see through all the windows, nobody would want to make other people feel small anymore." The words settled over the lobby like dawn breaking after a long night, illuminating truths that had been there all along, but somehow forgotten in the harsh light of wealth and status. Daniel felt his heart expanding until he thought it might burst with pride and love for this remarkable little person who could speak 9 languages, but whose greatest gift was her ability to speak the language of the heart with fluency that exceeded any earthly tongue. And in that moment, as silence stretched across the marble expanse of the Grand Aurora Hotel, everyone present understood that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. What? Just a display of linguistic skill, but a demonstration of wisdom that had the power to change lives, to shift perspectives, to remind the world that sometimes the most profound truths came from the smallest voices. The battle was far from over. But the first victory belonged entirely to Emma Carter, daughter of a janitor, speaker of 9 languages, and teacher of truths that no amount of money could buy. The silence that followed Emma's words stretched like a held breath across the Grand Aurora's lobby, filled with the weight of truth that no one quite knew how to process. Al Mansour stood motionless, his earlier confidence crumbling like sand castles before an incoming tide. The billionaire who had commanded boardrooms across 5 continents found himself speechless before an 8-year-old girl whose weapon was nothing more dangerous than wisdom wrapped in innocence. But Emma's gentle challenge had created something unexpected in the marble expanse, a moment of collective vulnerability, where pretenses began to fall away like autumn leaves. Hotel guests who moments before had been eager spectators to what they'd assumed would be a child's humiliation now found themselves examining their own assumptions about worth and dignity. "You speak of windows," Al Mansour said finally, his voice lacking its earlier authority. "But some windows look out onto palaces and others onto—" He gestured vaguely at Daniel's cleaning supplies, unable to finish the comparison that had seemed so natural moments before. Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to all new concepts, her small brow furrowed in concentration. "But Papa taught me that the most beautiful views aren't always from the highest floors," she said thoughtfully. "Sometimes the best windows are the ones that let you see gardens where children play, or kitchens where families share meals, or libraries where people discover new worlds." She looked directly at Al Mansour, with eyes that held no judgment, only curiosity. "What do you see from your windows, Mr. Al Mansour?" The question landed with surgical precision, cutting through layers of wealth and status to reach something more fundamental. For perhaps the first time in decades, Khalid Al Mansour found himself considering what he actually saw from his penthouse offices and luxury suites, and realizing that the view had become disappointingly empty of anything that truly mattered. "I see," he began, then paused as if the words he was about to speak surprised even him. "I see buildings, investments, properties that I own." "But do you see people?" Emma asked gently. The silence that followed was deafening. Around them, the lobby had become a theater where every observer was both audience and participant in a drama that was reshaping their understanding of power, privilege, and purpose. Al Mansour's carefully constructed facade began to show hairline fractures. "I employ thousands of people," he said defensively, but his voice lacked conviction. "That's wonderful," Emma replied with genuine enthusiasm that caught him off guard. "Do you know their names?" Some of them, yes." "Do you know their children's names?" The question was asked without malice, but its impact was profound. Al Mansour's mouth opened and closed wordlessly as he realized that he couldn't remember the last time he had asked an employee about their family, their dreams, their hopes beyond their usefulness to his empire. Emma seemed to sense his struggle, and with the intuitive kindness that children sometimes possess, offered him a lifeline. "My papa knows everyone's name here at the hotel," she said proudly. "He knows that Mrs. Rodriguez in housekeeping has 3 children and that her youngest wants to be a veterinarian. He knows that James at the front desk is studying engineering at night school and that Linda in the restaurant sends money to her mother in the Philippines every month." Daniel felt warmth spread through his chest as Emma continued painting a picture of his daily interactions with his colleagues. What he had seen as simple human decency, Emma was presenting as something valuable and admirable. "When Papa cleans their workspace," Emma went on, "he always leaves little notes of encouragement for the people who'll use those spaces the next day. He writes them in different languages so that everyone feels welcomed in their own words." This revelation sent a murmur through the crowd. Several hotel employees exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from professional neutrality to something approaching wonder. They had received those notes, small pieces of paper with encouraging words in their native languages, but had never known their source. Al Mansour's carefully maintained composure finally cracked completely. "You leave notes?" he asked Daniel directly, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel, who had remained largely silent during his daughter's extraordinary demonstration, stepped forward with the quiet dignity that had sustained him through years of financial struggle and social invisibility. "Everyone deserves to feel seen," he said simply. Language is just one way of letting people know they matter. But Al Mansour stopped himself before completing the sentence, suddenly aware of how his automatic assumptions sounded when spoken aloud. A janitor, Daniel finished gently. Yes, I am. I clean floors and empty trash cans and maintain this beautiful space so that people like you can conduct your important business in comfort. He paused, his eyes meeting Al Mansour's without challenge or submission, simply human to human. I used to be a professor of linguistics at Columbia University. I published papers on language preservation and cultural identity. I spoke at conferences in 12 countries. The lobby grew impossibly quieter, if such a thing were possible. Every person present was now fully invested in this unexpected autobiography unfolding before them. What happened? Someone in the crowd asked quietly. Daniel's hand found Emma's shoulder, drawing strength from her presence. My wife Elena was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer when Emma was 3 years old. The medical bills, they consumed everything. Our savings, our house, my tenure-track position, when I had to take extended leave to care for her. His voice remained steady, but Emma slipped her small hand into his larger one. Elena made me promise 2 things before she died. First, that I would never let bitterness poison my heart. Second, that I would give Emma every opportunity to explore the beautiful complexity of human communication. Al Mansour's face had gone ashen. The trajectory of a life destroyed by circumstances beyond control, circumstances that his wealth could have addressed as easily as paying for lunch, struck him with the force of revelation. That's why Papa took this job. Emma added, her voice carrying perfect clarity in the silent space. It pays for my books and my language tutoring, and it has flexible hours so he can help me with homework and take me to the library and listen to me practice pronunciation. She looked around the lobby with evident pride. And it's important work. Every morning when we arrive, Papa makes this whole place shine so that people can have their meetings and celebrations and important conversations in a space that feels special and beautiful. He's like an artist, except his canvas is this whole hotel. The reframing was so complete, so generous, that several people in the crowd found themselves seeing the marble floors and gleaming surfaces with new eyes. What they had taken for granted as simply well-maintained space was actually the result of one man's dedication to creating beauty for others, even when those others dismissed him as invisible. Al Mansour stood frozen in the center of this revelation, his billion-dollar empire suddenly feeling small and meaningless compared to the dignity and purpose that radiated from a janitor and his 8-year-old daughter. I had no idea, he whispered. How could you? Emma asked without accusation. Papa says that one of the gifts of speaking many languages is that you start to understand how different people see the world. But if you only ever speak to people who see the world the same way you do, then you miss out on so many beautiful perspectives. She tilted her head with that characteristic expression of curiosity that had been charming adults since she could walk. Have you ever tried talking to someone whose life is completely different from yours? The question hung in the air, like a challenge wrapped in innocence. Al Mansour realized that despite his international business dealings, despite his multilingual capabilities, he had spent decades surrounded by people who were fundamentally like him, wealthy, powerful, insulated from the struggles that defined most human existence. I speak to many people, he said weakly. But do you listen? Emma pressed gently. Really listen, not just wait for your turn to talk. The distinction was devastating in its simplicity. Al Mansour thought of countless business dinners, charity galas, and board meetings where conversation had been performance rather than genuine communication. When was the last time he had asked someone about their dreams rather than their quarterly projections? Emma seemed to sense his internal struggle, and with the generous spirit that defined her character, offered him another pathway forward. "Would you like to try now?" she asked. "You could ask Papa about his favorite language, or about the poetry he reads to me before bedtime, or about the stories he tells me about Mama." The invitation was so pure, so free of ulterior motive, that Al Mansour found himself genuinely considering it. Here was a child offering him the chance to engage in real human connection, something his wealth had systematically isolated him from for years. He began, then stopped looking around the lobby at the crowd of faces, watching this unprecedented drama unfold. "Perhaps this isn't the appropriate venue for—" "Why not?" Emma asked with the directness that only children possessed. "Everyone here speaks at least one language, which means everyone here has stories to tell and things to teach each other." She looked around the lobby with the enthusiasm of someone discovering a treasure trove. "There are probably dozens of languages represented right here in this room. Think of all the windows we could look through together." The suggestion was so audacious, so contrary to the usual social hierarchies that governed spaces like the Grand Aurora, that it took everyone a moment to process. Emma was proposing nothing less than the transformation of an exclusive hotel lobby into a multicultural celebration of human diversity. "That's impossible," Al Mansour said automatically, but his protest lacked conviction. "Is it?" Emma challenged gently. "You started this by testing my languages. But what if instead of testing we started sharing? What if everyone here taught everyone else something beautiful in their language?" The idea rippled through the crowd like electricity. Several guests began looking at each other with new interest, suddenly seeing potential teachers and students rather than merely fellow consumers of luxury services. Evelyn Harper, who had been watching this entire exchange with growing amazement, stepped forward with the decisive authority that had made her legendary in hotel management. "The Grand Aurora has always prided itself on international hospitality," she announced to the assembled crowd. "Perhaps it's time we lived up to that reputation in a new way." Her endorsement gave permission for something unprecedented to begin happening. A Japanese businessman approached an elderly Italian woman and asked in careful English if she might teach him to say "beautiful morning" in her language. A young woman from Brazil began showing a family from Germany how to pronounce "obrigada" correctly, while they taught her the subtle differences between various German expressions of gratitude. Emma watched this spontaneous eruption of cultural exchange with delight, but her attention remained focused on Al Mansour, who stood in the center of the growing celebration, looking lost and uncertain. "You seem sad again," she observed quietly, moving to stand beside him as conversations in multiple languages bloomed around them. "I don't belong here," he admitted, his voice barely audible above the growing hum of intercultural communication. "Why not?" "Because I don't. I can't." He struggled to articulate feelings he had never before been forced to confront. "I don't know how to talk to people without talking about business or money or deals." Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important problems. "What did you love when you were my age?" she asked. The question caught him completely off guard. "What? Before you learned about business and money and deals, when you were 8 years old, what made you happy?" Al Mansour stood silent for a long moment, his mind reaching back across decades of accumulated wealth and responsibility to touch memories he had buried so deeply he had forgotten they existed. I loved stories," he said finally, his voice filled with wonder at the rediscovery. "My grandmother used to tell me stories in Arabic about jinn and treasure and brave heroes who fought for justice." Emma's face lit up with genuine excitement. "Stories are just another kind of language. They're how we share the most important parts of ourselves with other people. She gestured to Daniel, who had been watching this exchange with growing understanding. Papa tells me stories every night. Sometimes they're about Mama and all the places she dreamed of visiting. Sometimes they're folk tales from different cultures that teach lessons about kindness and courage. And sometimes, she leaned closer to Al Mansour, as if sharing a secret. Sometimes, he makes up stories about a little girl who can speak to people in any language and help them understand each other better. The parallel was so clear, so beautifully articulated, that Al Mansour felt something shift fundamentally in his chest. Here was this child living out the very stories her father told her, using her gifts not for personal gain, but to build bridges between people who had forgotten how to see each other's humanity. "Could you," he asked hesitantly, "could you tell me one of those stories?" Emma's smile could have powered the entire hotel. "I could tell you one, or—" She looked meaningfully at Daniel. "Papa could tell you one in Arabic, the way stories are meant to be told when they come from the heart." Al Mansour turned to Daniel with an expression that held none of his earlier arrogance. "Would you? I haven't heard a story told in Arabic since my grandmother died 20 years ago." Daniel's response was immediate and warm. "It would be my honor." As father and daughter found seats on one of the lobby's elegant sofas, something magical happened. The spontaneous language exchanges happening throughout the space began to coalesce around them, drawn by the promise of story and the rare sight of genuine human connection transcending social barriers. Al Mansour settled into a chair facing them, his billion-dollar empire momentarily forgotten in favor of something infinitely more valuable, the chance to remember what it felt like to be simply human, listening to stories told by someone who understood that the greatest wealth was measured not in currency, but in the connections we forge with one another. Daniel began to speak in the flowing rhythms of classical Arabic, his voice carrying the trained projection of his former academic life, but warmed by the love he felt for his daughter and the unexpected grace of this moment. The story he told was ancient but timeless, a tale of a poor man who possessed a magical gift for languages and used it to bring peace between warring kingdoms. As the story unfolded, Emma translated key passages for those who didn't speak Arabic, but her translations were more than mere linguistic conversion. She added context, explained cultural nuances, and helped everyone understand not just what was being said, but why it mattered. And Khalid Al Mansour, billionaire oil magnate and international power broker, found himself crying for the first time in decades. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition that he had spent his entire adult life accumulating everything except the things that actually mattered. The transformation was far from complete, but in that moment, surrounded by the organic symphony of human voices sharing their languages and stories, Al Mansour began to understand what Emma had been trying to teach him from the beginning, that true wealth wasn't found in bank accounts or business empires, but in the connections that remind us of our shared humanity. The lobby of the Grand Aurora had become something unprecedented, a space where social hierarchies dissolved in favor of genuine human communication, where a janitor could be recognized as a scholar, where a child could be acknowledged as a teacher, and where even a billionaire could remember what it felt like to be simply, beautifully human. The story Daniel told in flowing Arabic had woven itself through the Grand Aurora's lobby, like incense touching every heart present, with its ancient wisdom about the power of understanding across cultures. As his voice faded into reverent silence, Al Mansour sat motionless, tears still glistening on his cheeks, his entire worldview shifting, like tectonic plates, beneath the surface of his carefully constructed identity. Emma watched him with the patient compassion of someone far older than her 8 years, understanding intuitively that moments of profound change required gentle handling. The lobby around them had transformed into something resembling a living tapestry of human connection, with conversations in dozens of languages creating a symphony of cultural exchange that none of them had imagined possible an hour before. "That story," Al Mansour whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "My grandmother told me a version of that same story when I was exactly Emma's age." Daniel nodded with the understanding of someone who had spent his life studying how stories traveled across cultures and generations, carrying universal truths in language-specific vessels. "The best stories belong to everyone," he said gently. "They find their way into every culture because they speak to something essential in the human experience." "I had forgotten." Al Mansour admitted, his usual commanding presence replaced by something vulnerable and achingly human. "I had forgotten what it felt like to hear stories told with love instead of profit." Emma leaned forward in her seat, her small hands clasped together with the intensity of someone about to ask a very important question. "Mr. Al Mansour, may I ask you something personal?" The billionaire, who had spent decades guarding his privacy with teams of lawyers and security personnel, found himself nodding without hesitation. "Of course. When you were little and your grandmother told you stories, what did you want to be when you grew up?" The question struck him with the force of recognition, as if Emma had reached across time to touch the child he had once been, before ambition and accumulation had buried those early dreams beneath layers of sophisticated cynicism. "I wanted to be an explorer," he said slowly, the words seeming to surprise him as they emerged. "Not the kind who conquers new lands, but the kind who discovers beautiful things that already exist and shares them with people who might never get to see them otherwise." Emma's face illuminated with understanding. "But you did become an explorer. You explore different countries and cultures for your business. You speak multiple languages and travel all over the world." Al Mansour looked at her with confusion. "But I go to those places for meetings and deals. I stay in hotels like this one, and eat in restaurants that cater to international business travelers. I don't really experience those cultures." "Maybe," Emma said thoughtfully, "you just forgot how to explore with wonder instead of just looking for profit." The observation was so gentle, yet so penetrating, that Al Mansour felt as if Emma had just handed him a mirror that showed not who he had become but who he had originally intended to be. "How does an 8-year-old possess such wisdom?" he asked, though the question was directed more to the universe than to anyone specific. "Papa teaches me to pay attention," Emma replied matter-of-factly. "He says that if you really listen to people and really look at the world around you, you can learn something beautiful every single day." Daniel felt his heart swell with pride as he watched his daughter demonstrate the very lessons he had tried to instill in her. "Emma sees with fresh eyes," he added quietly. "She hasn't learned yet that she's supposed to stop noticing magic in ordinary moments." "Magic," Al Mansour repeated, as if tasting a word he hadn't used in decades. "I can't remember the last time I thought about magic." "It's everywhere," Emma assured him, with the confidence of someone who had never stopped believing in wonder. "Like right now, look around this lobby. An hour ago, all these people were strangers who only saw each other's clothes and accents and assumptions. Now they're sharing their languages and learning about each other's cultures and discovering that they have more in common than they thought." Al Mansour followed her gaze around the transformed space, seeing it through her eyes for the first time. The elderly Italian woman was teaching a group of young business travelers how to express different emotions in her native language, her animated gestures bringing laughter and delight to faces that had been stern with professional concentration moments before. The Japanese businessman was showing a family of tourists how to write their names in beautiful calligraphy, while they taught him phrases in Spanish that made him smile with genuine pleasure. That's magic. Emma continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone stating an obvious truth. When people connect with each other in ways that make them both happier and wiser, that's the most powerful magic there is. Evelyn Harper approached their small group with the graceful efficiency that had made her legendary, but her usual professional demeanor had softened into something more personal. "I've been managing luxury hotels for over 20 years, she said, her voice filled with wonder, "and I've never seen anything like what's happening here tonight." She gestured to the ongoing cultural exchanges happening throughout the lobby. "Our guests typically interact with polite distance. They're cordial but reserved, respectful but separate. Tonight, this space feels like a celebration of humanity itself." Al Mansour looked up at her with an expression that held confusion and possibility in equal measure. "But surely this kind of mixing isn't typical for an establishment of this caliber." Evelyn's response was immediate and firm. "Mr. Al Mansour, the Grand Aurora, has always prided itself on providing exceptional experiences for our guests. Tonight I've watched people discover connections and insights that will probably influence them for the rest of their lives. If that isn't exceptional service, I don't know what is." Emma clapped her hands together with delight. Could this happen more often? Could hotels be places where people learn about each other instead of just sleeping and eating and having meetings? The suggestion was so revolutionary, yet so obviously beneficial, that Evelyn found herself considering it seriously. It would require a complete reimagining of hospitality, she mused aloud. Instead of simply providing luxury amenities, we could facilitate cultural exchange. Instead of isolation, we could offer connection. But would wealthy guests want that? Al Mansour asked, his business instincts automatically raising practical concerns. Don't people come to places like this precisely to avoid having to interact with people like me? Daniel suggested gently, without accusation. Al Mansour's face flushed with shame as he realized what his unfinished question had revealed about his assumptions. "I didn't mean..." "But you did mean it," Emma interjected, though her tone held no judgment. "And that's okay, because it means you're being honest about how you really think. Papa always says that you can't change something until you're willing to see it clearly." She stood up from the sofa and moved to stand directly in front of Al Mansour, her small frame somehow commanding his complete attention despite the difference in their size and status. "Mr. Al Mansour, can I tell you what I think wealthy people really want?" He nodded, unable to look away from her earnest face. "I think they want the same things everyone wants. They want to feel important and valued and loved. They want to learn new things and have interesting experiences and make connections with other people that make them feel less alone in the world." Emma paused, tilting her head with that characteristic expression of deep thought. The difference is that wealthy people have so much money that they sometimes forget there are other ways to get those things. They think they have to buy importance and experiences and even relationships, but the best parts of life can't actually be purchased. The lobby had grown quieter as Emma spoke with nearby conversations, pausing, as people found themselves drawn into her impromptu philosophy lesson. Her words carried the weight of truth that transcended age and experience. "Tonight," she continued, "everyone here is getting something valuable, new knowledge, new friendships, new perspectives, and nobody had to pay for any of it. It's all free because people decided to share what they already had instead of keeping it to themselves." Al Mansour felt something fundamental shifting in his understanding of value and exchange. For decades, he had operated under the assumption that anything worthwhile required payment, that relationships were transactional, that even kindness came with a price tag. But Emma was describing a completely different economy, one based on generosity rather than scarcity, connection rather than competition. But surely, he said slowly, working through concepts that felt foreign, after years of thinking in purely commercial terms, there have to be practical considerations. People need to eat, to have shelter, to provide for their families. Of course, Emma agreed readily. Papa works hard every day to take care of those things for us. But he also says that once you have enough to meet your basic needs, the most important riches can't be stored in bank accounts. Daniel watched his daughter articulate concepts that had taken him years of loss and struggle to understand, marveling at her ability to see clearly through the fog of social conditioning that clouded most adult thinking. Emma's right, he said quietly. I lost my career, my house, my savings when Elena got sick. But I never lost the things that mattered most, my love for Emma, my appreciation for beauty and knowledge, my ability to find meaning in small daily acts of service. And look what you've built with those things, Evelyn added, her voice filled with genuine admiration. Emma is one of the most remarkable children I've ever encountered. And this lobby full of people connecting across cultural barriers exists because you both chose to respond to mockery with grace and wisdom. Al Mansour looked around the space with new eyes, beginning to understand that what he was witnessing wasn't just a spontaneous cultural exchange, but a demonstration of wealth that couldn't be measured in traditional terms. Daniel and Emma possessed something he had spent billions trying to acquire: the ability to create genuine human connection, to inspire people to be better versions of themselves, to transform ordinary moments into experiences of profound meaning. I want to understand, he said suddenly, his voice carrying the intensity of someone making a crucial decision. I want to learn how to see the world the way you both see it. Emma's response was immediate and enthusiastic. That's wonderful. Learning new ways of seeing is just like learning new languages. It takes practice, but it opens up so many beautiful possibilities. She looked around the lobby, her gaze settling on the various groups of people still engaged in cultural exchange. Maybe you could start by really talking to some of the people here. Not about business or money, but about their lives and dreams and the things that make them happy. But I wouldn't know how to begin. Al Mansour admitted, his usual confidence replaced by uncertainty that was both humbling and oddly refreshing. The same way you'd begin learning any new language, Daniel suggested. Start with simple phrases and basic concepts, then gradually build complexity as you become more comfortable. Emma nodded enthusiastically. And remember that everyone here has something to teach you, just like you probably have things to teach them. The Italian lady might know about art or cooking or family traditions. The Japanese businessman might understand meditation or poetry or different ways of thinking about respect. She paused, her expression becoming more serious. But the most important thing is to ask questions because you genuinely want to know the answers, not because you're trying to impress anyone or get something from them. Al Mansour felt a flutter of something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine curiosity about other people's inner lives. And if I make mistakes, if I say something wrong or offensive, then you apologize and try to do better next time, Emma replied with the practical wisdom of someone who had never been afraid of making mistakes. Papa says that's how all real learning happens. You try something new, you notice what works and what doesn't, and you adjust. The simplicity of the approach was both reassuring and terrifying for someone who had spent decades avoiding any situation where he might appear vulnerable or uninformed. But watching Emma navigate complex social and emotional terrain with such grace, Al Mansour began to consider that maybe his careful self-protection had cost him more than it had gained him. Would you, he began hesitantly, then stopped and tried again with more conviction. Would you and Emma be willing to introduce me to some of the people here to help me learn how to have real conversations? The request was so humble, so completely different from his earlier arrogance that Daniel felt moved to offer immediate support. It would be our pleasure. Emma practically bounced with excitement. This is going to be so much fun. It's like we're all going to be explorers together, discovering new worlds through the people we meet. And so began an extraordinary evening of human connection that none of them would ever forget. With Emma as their enthusiastic guide and Daniel providing gentle wisdom, Al Mansour embarked on a journey of discovery that had nothing to do with accumulating wealth or power, and everything to do with remembering what it meant to be genuinely curious about other human beings. Their first stop was with Maria Rossi, the elderly Italian woman whose animated storytelling had drawn crowds throughout the evening. Emma made the introduction with characteristic warmth, explaining that Mr. Al Mansour was learning how to have conversations about beautiful things instead of just business things. "Ah," Maria said, with a knowing smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "You want to remember how to see with the heart, instead of just the wallet." Yes. Al Mansour felt his defenses rise automatically at what might have been considered an insult, but Emma's presence reminded him to approach the comment with curiosity instead of offense. "Yes," he said simply. "I think I've forgotten how to do that." What followed was a conversation unlike any Al Mansour had experienced in decades. Maria spoke of her late husband's passion for restoring old furniture of Sunday dinners, with 3 generations gathered around tables laden with recipes, passed down through centuries of the way morning light fell through the windows of her small apartment in Rome, and made ordinary objects look touched by divinity. She asked him about his grandmother's stories about the foods that reminded him of childhood, about moments when he had felt truly content rather than simply successful. And slowly, carefully, with Emma offering gentle encouragement and Daniel providing thoughtful questions, Al Mansour began to remember pieces of himself that he had buried beneath years of commercial ambition. From Maria, they moved to Hiroshi Tanaka, the Japanese businessman who had been teaching calligraphy. With quiet intensity, he spoke of the meditation involved in forming each character, of how the practice of writing beautiful letters had taught him patience and presence in all areas of his life. "In business," Hiroshi said thoughtfully, "we are always rushing toward the next deal, the next quarter, the next milestone. But calligraphy teaches that there is profound value in slowing down, in giving complete attention to the present moment." Al Mansour found himself sharing his own struggles with constant motion, with the way success had become a treadmill that never allowed him to pause and appreciate what he had already achieved. For the first time in years, he spoke about feeling tired, not physically, but spiritually exhausted from the endless pursuit of more, without ever defining what enough might look like. The conversations continued throughout the evening, each one revealing new facets of human experience that Al Mansour had overlooked in his focus on financial metrics and market dominance. He spoke with the Brazilian woman about the importance of music and dance in creating community, with a young German couple about their decision to prioritize travel and cultural exploration over material accumulation, with hotel staff members who shared stories of finding dignity and purpose in service-oriented work. Through it all, Emma served as both translator and teacher, helping Al Mansour understand not just the words being spoken, but the emotions and values underlying them. She showed him how to ask follow-up questions that demonstrated genuine interest, how to share his own experiences in ways that invited connection rather than competition, how to listen with the kind of attention that made people feel truly heard. As the evening progressed, something remarkable happened. Al Mansour's usual commanding presence softened into something more approachable, more human. His questions became more thoughtful, his responses more personal. People who had initially been intimidated by his wealth and status began to see him as simply another person seeking connection and understanding. And perhaps most importantly, Al Mansour began to experience the joy that Emma had tried to describe, the genuine pleasure of learning about other people's lives, not for any strategic advantage, but simply because human stories were inherently interesting and valuable. "This is extraordinary," he confided to Daniel during a quiet moment while Emma was helping an elderly man from Morocco teach some teenagers basic Arabic phrases. "I feel like I'm discovering a completely different world that was there all along, but I was too busy to notice it." Daniel smiled with the satisfaction of someone watching a student make breakthrough discoveries. That's exactly what Emma meant when she talked about magic being everywhere. It's not that the magic suddenly appeared, it's that you finally learned how to see it. Al Mansour nodded slowly, understanding, beginning to crystallize into something approaching wisdom. And the remarkable thing is that seeing it this way, connecting with people this way, it doesn't cost anything, but it feels more valuable than anything I've ever purchased. "Because it is more valuable," Emma said, appearing beside them with the timing that children seem to possess for the most important conversations. "Money can buy you things, but it can't buy you the feeling of understanding someone else's heart, or having them understand yours." She looked up at Al Mansour with eyes that held both pride and hope. "How do you feel now compared to how you felt when you first walked into the hotel tonight?" Al Mansour considered the question seriously, taking inventory of his internal landscape in a way he hadn't done in years. "Lighter," he said finally, "as if I've been carrying something heavy for so long that I forgot it was there, and now I've finally set it down." "What do you think that heavy thing was?" Emma asked, with the gentle persistence of someone who understood that the most important questions often required careful consideration. "Loneliness." Al Mansour replied without hesitation, the word emerging with the force of long-suppressed truth. "I think I've been profoundly lonely for years, but I was so busy accumulating things and achievements that I convinced myself I didn't need genuine human connection." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable in a way that Al Mansour hadn't allowed himself to be since childhood. Emma reached out and took his hand with the natural kindness that defined her character. "You're not lonely anymore," she said simply. "Because now you know how to connect with people in ways that make everyone involved feel richer and happier and more understood." And in that moment, surrounded by the ongoing symphony of cultural exchange that had transformed the Grand Aurora's lobby into something unprecedented, Khalid Al Mansour understood that Emma Carter had given him something infinitely more valuable than any business deal or investment opportunity. She had given him back his humanity, his capacity for wonder, his ability to find wealth in the connections that reminded him he was part of something larger and more beautiful than his individual ambitions. The evening was far from over, but already Al Mansour knew that his life had been fundamentally altered by an 8-year-old girl who spoke 9 languages, but whose greatest gift was her fluency in the universal language of the human heart. The revelation of his profound loneliness had cracked something open inside Khalid Al Mansour, and as Emma's small hand remained in his, he felt decades of carefully constructed emotional barriers beginning to crumble. The lobby around them continued to hum with the beautiful chaos of human connection. But for Al Mansour, the most important conversation was happening in the quiet space between a billionaire who had forgotten how to be human and an 8-year-old girl who had never stopped believing in the magic of genuine kindness. "Emma," he said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of someone about to make a decision that would change everything. I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Emma's eyes, bright with intelligence and compassion, focused on his face with the complete attention she gave to all important moments. I'm always honest, she said simply. Papa taught me that lying makes the world smaller and lonelier, but truth makes it bigger and more beautiful. Al Mansour felt a smile tugging at his lips, the first genuine smile he could remember in years. Of course you are. What I want to know is this: if you could change anything about the world, what would it be? The question was enormous, the kind that philosophers and world leaders struggled with, but Emma considered it with the same focused attention she brought to her language studies. Around them, the spontaneous cultural exchange continued, but Al Mansour found himself completely absorbed in waiting for her answer. I would want everyone to remember that we're all connected, Emma said finally. Like tonight, all these people discovered that they have more in common than they thought, and that made everyone happier. But tomorrow, most of them will probably go back to thinking of each other as strangers or competitors or people who are different in scary ways. She paused, her brow furrowed with the concentration of someone working through complex ideas. I wish there was a way to help people remember that feeling of connection, even when they're not in special places like this lobby tonight. The simplicity and profundity of her answer struck Al Mansour with the force of revelation. Here was a child who had identified the fundamental problem underlying most human suffering, the illusion of separation that caused people to compete rather than collaborate, to fear rather than embrace difference, to accumulate rather than share. What if, he said slowly, an idea beginning to take shape in his mind, what if there was a way to create more opportunities for people to have experiences like tonight? What if we could build places and programs specifically designed to help people connect across the barriers that usually keep them apart? Emma's face lit up with excitement. You mean like centers where people could come to learn about different cultures and languages and ways of thinking? Exactly like that. Al Mansour replied, his business mind beginning to engage with concepts of social impact rather than profit maximization for the first time in decades. Places where the wealthy and the working class, where people from different countries and backgrounds, where young and old could come together to share their knowledge and experiences. Daniel, who had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement, stepped closer to their conversation. That's a beautiful vision, he said thoughtfully. In my academic work, I always believed that language learning was most effective when it happened in contexts of genuine cultural exchange rather than sterile classroom environments. But could it actually work? Al Mansour asked, his excitement growing as the possibilities multiplied in his mind. Could we create sustainable programs that bring people together in meaningful ways? Evelyn Harper, who had been observing the transformation of her lobby with professional fascination, joined their small group. Mr. Al Mansour, what you're describing sounds like a revolution in hospitality. Instead of serving only the wealthy, hotels could become cultural exchange centers that serve humanity. The conversation was beginning to attract attention from other people in the lobby, drawn by the energy of collaborative problem-solving and shared vision. Maria Rossi, the Italian grandmother, who had taught Al Mansour about seeing with the heart, approached with curious interest. You are planning something beautiful, Wes, she asked, with the intuitive understanding that comes from a lifetime of reading human emotions. Emma looked up at the growing circle of people and felt a familiar surge of excitement, the same feeling she got when she successfully communicated in a new language for the first time. We're talking about creating places where everyone can be teachers and students at the same time, she explained. Where people can share their languages and cultures and stories with each other. Like what happened here tonight. Hiroshi Tanaka added his calm voice, carrying enthusiasm that his reserved demeanor couldn't quite hide. But organized and intentional rather than accidental. Exactly. Al Mansour exclaimed, his usual composure replaced by genuine passion. We could create a network of cultural exchange centers in major cities around the world. Places where business travelers could learn about local customs, where immigrants could share their heritage while learning about their new homes, where children like Emma could practice their languages with native speakers. The vision was expanding rapidly, fed by the collective imagination of people who had experienced firsthand the power of genuine cross-cultural connection. Ideas began flowing like water, finding its natural course: language immersion programs paired with cultural workshops, international food festivals that celebrated the stories behind traditional recipes, storytelling circles where elders from different cultures could share wisdom with younger generations. But how would you fund something like that? Daniel asked, his practical experience with financial constraints, adding necessary reality to the soaring dreams. Al Mansour's response came without hesitation. The same way I've funded everything else, through investment and vision. But this time the return wouldn't be measured in dollars. It would be measured in human connection, in cultural understanding, in the kind of wealth that Emma has been teaching me about all evening. He looked around the circle of faces, seeing not potential customers or business partners, but collaborative visionaries who could help build something unprecedented. I have the financial resources to make this happen. What I need are people who understand how to create genuine human connection, people like all of you. Emma clapped her hands together with delight. It would be like the whole world could have what we had tonight. People from everywhere could meet and learn from each other and discover that being different makes us more interesting, not more scary. The excitement in her voice was infectious, spreading through the growing group like flame through dry kindling. But it was Evelyn Harper who asked the crucial question that would determine whether this vision remained a beautiful dream or became practical reality. "Where would you start?" she asked. "How do you begin building something this ambitious?" Al Mansour looked at Emma, then at Daniel, then around the transformed lobby of the Grand Aurora Hotel. "We start here," he said with growing conviction. "Evelyn, what would it take to make the Grand Aurora the prototype for this kind of cultural exchange center?" Evelyn's mind immediately began working through the practical implications. "We'd need to redesign our programming entirely. Instead of just providing luxury accommodations, we'd offer cultural immersion experiences. Language exchanges, cooking classes taught by guests from different countries, storytelling sessions, art workshops. We could have a different country featured each month," Maria suggested, her eyes bright with possibility. "And people from that culture could come to teach and share while others come to learn. And it wouldn't just be for wealthy travelers." Daniel added, his voice carrying the passion of his academic background. "If you really want to create understanding across social barriers, you'd need to make it accessible to people from all economic backgrounds." Al Mansour nodded emphatically. "Scholarships, sliding scale fees, community partnerships. The goal isn't profit, it's connection." Emma looked up at him with an expression of pure joy. "Mr. Al Mansour, you really are an explorer. You're just exploring ways to help people understand each other instead of exploring new lands." The observation struck him with the force of completion, as if Emma had just helped him solve a puzzle he'd been working on his entire life without realizing it. "You're right," he said with wonder. "This is what I was meant to do, not accumulate wealth for its own sake, but use resources to create opportunities for human connection and understanding." As if drawn by the magnetic pull of shared purpose, more people from the evening's spontaneous cultural exchange began joining their conversation. Soon, they had a committed group of individuals from a dozen different countries, all eager to contribute their expertise and enthusiasm to this emerging vision. The Brazilian woman Lucia spoke of community-building techniques from her homeland. The German couple offered insights into sustainable tourism models they'd encountered in their travels. Hotel staff members contributed practical knowledge about logistics and operations. Each person's unique perspective added another layer of possibility to the growing collaborative vision. "You know what this reminds me of?" Emma said suddenly, her voice carrying the excitement of someone making an important connection. "It's like we're creating a new language not made of words, but made of experiences that help people understand each other better." The metaphor was so perfect, so precisely articulated, that it stopped the conversation entirely. Everyone present understood that Emma had just captured the essence of what they were trying to build, a new form of communication that transcended traditional barriers and created understanding through shared experience. Al Mansour knelt down so that he was at Emma's eye level, his expression serious but warm. "Emma, I want to ask you something very important. Would you be willing to help me build this dream, not just as inspiration, but as an active partner?" Emma's eyes widened with surprise and delight. "What would I do? You'd be our chief cultural ambassador," Al Mansour replied, his tone conveying that this was a real offer, not merely a kind gesture. "You'd help design programs for children, test our language exchange methods, and most importantly, you'd remind all of us adults, when we start taking ourselves too seriously and forgetting that the point is to have fun while learning." The title was wonderful, but Emma's response showed that she understood the deeper implications. "That would mean I could help other children learn that speaking different languages isn't just about getting good grades, it's about making friends with people from all over the world." "Exactly," Al Mansour confirmed. "And your father would be our director of cultural education if he's interested." His academic background, combined with his practical wisdom about human dignity, would be invaluable. Daniel felt his world shifting yet again, but this time toward possibility rather than loss. "Are you serious? You're offering me a chance to return to meaningful educational work." "I'm offering you a chance to do the most important educational work imaginable," Al Mansour replied. "Teaching people that their common humanity is more significant than their surface differences." The transformation was so complete, so utterly different from the arrogant billionaire who had mocked a janitor's daughter just hours before, that several people in the group found themselves wiping away tears of genuine amazement. Emma looked around the circle of faces, seeing the excitement and hope and shared commitment that her simple question about languages had somehow catalyzed. "Papa," she said quietly, "I think this is what Mama would have wanted for us." Daniel's composure finally broke entirely. He gathered Emma into his arms, holding her close as tears of joy and grief and overwhelming gratitude flowed freely. "Yes, sweetheart. This is exactly what she would have wanted." Elena had always believed that education was the key to creating a more just and compassionate world. She had encouraged Daniel's research into language preservation, not because it was prestigious, but because she understood that every language carried unique wisdom about what it meant to be human. To see that vision not only surviving, but expanding into something that could touch lives around the world felt like the most beautiful possible tribute to her memory. Then it settled. Al Mansour declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone making a binding commitment. "We begin immediately. Evelyn. I want to fund a complete transformation of the Grand Aurora into our prototype cultural exchange center. Daniel. I want you to design an educational framework that can be replicated globally. Emma. I want you to start planning what you'd want to teach other children about the joy of language learning." The practical details that followed were almost secondary to the emotional reality of what had been created. Al Mansour established a foundation, with more funding than Daniel had ever imagined possible, dedicated entirely to fostering cross-cultural understanding through experiential education. The Grand Aurora became the first of what would eventually be dozens of cultural bridge centers around the world, each one designed to bring people together across the artificial barriers that had kept them separate for too long. But perhaps the most beautiful transformation was the personal one that had taken place in Khalid Al Mansour himself. The man who had entered the lobby seeking to humiliate a janitor's daughter had been fundamentally changed by that same child's generosity of spirit and wisdom. He discovered that using his wealth to create connection rather than accumulation brought him a sense of purpose and fulfillment that no business success had ever provided. Emma threw herself into her new role with characteristic enthusiasm, developing language games that taught children not just vocabulary and grammar, but cultural context and emotional intelligence. Her natural ability to see beyond surface differences made her an extraordinary teacher, and soon the cultural bridge centers were hosting families from around the world who came specifically to learn from the 8-year-old polyglot who had started a movement. Daniel found himself not just returning to academic work, but pioneering an entirely new field that combined linguistics, cultural anthropology, and social psychology. His research into the connection between language learning and empathy development became foundational to the educational methods used throughout the cultural bridge network. The story of what had happened that night in the Grand Aurora's lobby spread far beyond the hotel's marble walls. News outlets picked up the tale of the billionaire who had tried to humiliate a janitor's daughter and instead discovered the meaning of true wealth. The story resonated across cultures and languages, inspiring similar initiatives in cities around the world. But for Emma, perhaps the most wonderful part of their new life was the evening routine that had developed in their transformed circumstances. Each night, after days filled with teaching and learning and connecting with people from dozens of different cultures, she and Daniel would sit together in their beautiful new apartment, provided as part of Daniel's position with the foundation and practice languages together. Sometimes they would read poetry in Arabic, honoring the cultural traditions that Al Mansour had shared with them. Sometimes they would work through complex German philosophical texts that stretched Emma's analytical abilities. Sometimes they would simply tell each other stories in whatever language felt most appropriate for the emotion they wanted to convey. But always before Emma went to sleep, Daniel would tell her something in Polish, the language Elena had used for lullabies and love songs, and the quiet moments when words needed to carry the weight of a mother's hopes for her daughter's future. Kocham cię moja mała uczona, he would whisper just as Elena had done. I love you, my little scholar. And Emma would respond, as she always did. Kocham cię też, Papa. I love you too. On this particular night, nearly a year after the evening that had changed everything, Emma had an additional thought to share. Papa, do you think Mama knows about all the people we're helping learn to understand each other? Daniel considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, looking out the window at the city lights that represented millions of people, each carrying their own languages and stories and dreams. I think she knows, he said finally. And I think she's proud that her daughter is using her gifts to build bridges instead of walls. Emma nodded with satisfaction, then surprised him with another observation. Mr. Al Mansour asked me today if I thought we had changed his life, or if he had changed ours. What did you tell him? I told him that the best changes happen when everyone involved becomes more themselves, not less. He didn't become a different person, he just remembered who he was supposed to be all along. The wisdom in her words struck Daniel anew, reminding him that his 8-year-old daughter continued to see truths that eluded most adults. And what about us? Do you think we became more ourselves? Emma considered this carefully, her young mind working through concepts that would challenge professional philosophers. "I think we were always ourselves," she said finally. "But now we get to be ourselves in a bigger world, with more people to love and learn from." As Emma drifted off to sleep, Daniel remained by her window, marveling at the journey that had brought them from a moment of potential humiliation to a life of purpose and connection that exceeded his wildest dreams. The janitor who had once cleaned floors in silence now developed curricula that were changing how the world thought about education and cultural exchange. The little girl who had been mocked for claiming to speak 9 languages now taught thousands of children that linguistic diversity was one of humanity's greatest treasures. And somewhere across the city, Khalid Al Mansour was probably awake as well, planning the next cultural bridge center, or reviewing educational proposals, or writing in the journal. He had started keeping a practice Emma had suggested to help him process the emotional richness of his transformed life. The man who had once measured his worth in billions of dollars had discovered that true wealth was measured in moments of human connection, in the light that appeared in children's eyes when they successfully communicated in a new language, in the tears of joy that flowed when people from different cultures found common ground in shared stories and dreams. In the quiet of their apartment, with Emma sleeping peacefully, and the city humming with the voices of countless people speaking countless languages, Daniel whispered a prayer of gratitude in the language Elena had taught him, was the most beautiful of all the language of love that transcended words and connected every human heart to every other human heart, across all the barriers that seemed so important and were ultimately so meaningless. The story that had begun with laughter designed to humiliate had become a legacy of connection that would touch lives for generations to come. And at its center always was the truth that Emma had tried to teach from the very beginning, that the most profound wealth wasn't found in what we accumulated for ourselves, but in what we shared with others, not in the languages we spoke to exclude, but in the bridges we built to include, not in the power we held over others, but in the love we offered to everyone we encountered on our shared journey through this beautiful, complicated, endlessly interconnected world. The greatest magic, as Emma had always known, was simply remembering that we all belong to each other. The revelation of his profound loneliness had created a sacred space around Al Mansour, and as the evening deepened in the Grand Aurora's transformed lobby, he found himself experiencing something he had forgotten existed: the simple joy of being genuinely seen and accepted by other human beings. The conversations continued to flow around them like tributaries feeding into a great river of understanding, but the most significant transformation was happening in the quiet moments between words, in the spaces where hearts recognized hearts, across all the artificial barriers that wealth and status had constructed. "Mr. Al Mansour," Emma said suddenly, her voice carrying the weight of someone about to share an important revelation. "I want to tell you something my mama used to say before she went to heaven." The lobby seemed to quiet around them, as if the universe itself was leaning in to listen. Al Mansour found himself holding his breath, understanding intuitively that Emma was about to offer him something precious and irreplaceable. "Mama used to say that every person we meet is carrying a secret treasure, but most people spend their whole lives without ever showing it to anyone because they're afraid it won't be valuable enough." Emma's eyes held depths that seemed impossible for her age, but she said that if you approach people with love instead of judgment, they'll sometimes share their treasure with you, and when that happens, those people become richer than they were before. The words settled over Al Mansour like a blessing, penetrating layers of cynicism and defensive sophistication that had accumulated over decades of viewing human interactions through the lens of profit and loss. "What was your mama's treasure?" he asked softly. Emma's smile could have illuminated the entire hotel. She could make people feel important just by the way she listened to them. Papa says that's why he fell in love with her, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because when she talked to someone, they felt like they were the only person in the world who mattered at that moment. Daniel's eyes filled with tears as Emma spoke of Elena's gift, remembering countless moments when his wife had transformed ordinary encounters into sacred exchanges simply by offering her complete attention and genuine care. "Your mama would be so proud of you tonight," he whispered. "You've been sharing that same treasure with everyone here." But the amazing thing, Emma continued, her voice growing stronger with excitement, is that when you share treasures like that, you don't lose them. They multiply. Like tonight, everyone here discovered treasures in each other, and now we all have more beautiful things to carry in our hearts than we did this morning. Al Mansour felt something fundamental shifting in his understanding of wealth and abundance. For his entire adult life, he had operated under the assumption that resources were finite, that gaining meant someone else had to lose, that success required scarcity. But Emma was describing a completely different economy, where sharing increased rather than diminished wealth, where generosity created abundance rather than shortage. "Emma," he said slowly, his voice thick with emotion, "would you be willing to teach me how to find and share treasures the way your mama did?" The question hung in the air between them, vulnerable and hopeful, in a way that Al Mansour hadn't allowed himself to be since childhood. Around them, the ongoing cultural exchange provided a backdrop of possibility, proof that what Emma described wasn't naive idealism, but practical wisdom with the power to transform lives. "Of course," Emma replied immediately, then paused with the thoughtful expression that preceded her most profound observations. "But I think you already know how to do it. You just forgot because you spent so long protecting yourself from people who might not appreciate your treasures." The insight struck him with the force of recognition. "What do you think my treasures are?" he asked, genuinely curious about how this remarkable child saw him. Emma studied his face with the intensity of someone reading a beloved book in a foreign language, working to understand not just the words, but the deeper meanings they carried. "I think you have the treasure of really big dreams," she said finally. "Dreams so big that they can help thousands of people if you learn how to share them with people who care about the same things you care about." She paused, tilting her head with characteristic concentration. "And I think you have the treasure of being brave enough to admit when you've made mistakes and want to do better. Most grown-ups are too scared to do that." Al Mansour felt his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name, something between gratitude and grief for all the years he had spent hiding these very qualities behind walls of defensive arrogance. "How did you see that when I've spent so much energy trying to appear perfect and invulnerable? Because perfect people don't need to prove how important they are," Emma replied with matter-of-fact wisdom. "Only scared people do that. And I could tell you were scared underneath all the fancy words and expensive clothes." The observation was so accurate, so gently delivered, that Al Mansour found himself laughing, not the cruel sound that had echoed through the lobby hours earlier, but genuine laughter filled with relief and self-recognition. "You're absolutely right. I have been scared. Terrified, actually." "Of what?" Emma asked with the direct curiosity that children possessed before the world taught them that some questions were too personal to voice. Al Mansour considered the question seriously, looking inward with an honesty he hadn't allowed himself in decades. "Of discovering that underneath all the money and power and accomplishments, I might not be anyone worth knowing." The admission fell into the space between them like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of vulnerability that touched everyone within earshot. Several of the ongoing conversations paused as people sensed the profound authenticity of the moment unfolding. Emma's response was immediate and fierce. "That's the silliest thing you've said all night. You've been worth knowing this whole time. You just needed to remember how to let people see the real you instead of the scared you." She stood up from her seat and moved to stand directly in front of him, her small frame somehow commanding his complete attention, despite the difference in their size and status. "Mr. Al Mansour, can I tell you what I see when I look at you now?" He nodded, unable to speak around the emotion that was threatening to overwhelm him entirely. "I see someone who loves stories and dreams of exploring beautiful places and helping people understand each other better. I see someone who's lonely because he forgot how to make real friends, but who could have the most wonderful friendships if he just remembered how to be himself. I see someone who has enough money to change the whole world if he uses it to build bridges instead of walls." Emma paused, her eyes never leaving his face. "And I see someone who loved his grandmother so much that he's been carrying her stories in his heart for 20 years, waiting for the right moment to share them with people who would understand how precious they are." The accuracy of her perception was staggering. Al Mansour felt as if Emma had reached directly into his soul and pulled out truths he had hidden so deeply that he had almost forgotten they existed. "How do you do that?" he whispered. "How do you see through everything to the heart of who someone really is?" "Practice," Emma replied simply. "Papa taught me that everyone has beautiful things inside them, but sometimes those things get covered up by hurt or fear or loneliness. If you look for the beautiful things instead of the scary things, you almost always find them." Daniel, who had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement at his daughter's wisdom, stepped closer to join their conversation. "Emma's right about practice," he said gently. "But she's also naturally gifted at seeing the best in people. It's one of the reasons her language learning has been so successful. She approaches every culture with genuine love and curiosity instead of judgment or superiority." Al Mansour looked between father and daughter, seeing not just their individual gifts, but the beautiful partnership they had created through years of mutual support and shared learning. "You've both given me something tonight that I didn't even know I was missing," he said quietly. "You've reminded me what it feels like to be seen and accepted for who I actually am rather than what I own or control." Evelyn Harper, who had been orchestrating the ongoing transformation of her lobby with the skill of a master conductor, approached their small group with an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with personal wonder. "Mr. Al Mansour, I've been thinking about your earlier question regarding the practical implementation of these cultural exchange concepts." Al Mansour turned to her with interest, his business instincts beginning to engage with possibilities for positive impact rather than mere profit generation. "What conclusions have you reached? That what we've witnessed tonight isn't just a beautiful accident. It's a replicable model for creating genuine human connection in an increasingly divided world," Evelyn replied with conviction. "The Grand Aurora could become a prototype for a completely new approach to hospitality, one that prioritizes cultural understanding over mere luxury consumption." Emma's eyes lit up with excitement. "You mean this could happen every night? People could come here to learn about each other instead of just sleeping in fancy beds?" "Better than that," Al Mansour said, his voice gaining strength as the vision crystallized in his mind. "We could create a network of such places in cities around the world. Hotels that serve as cultural bridges where business travelers could engage with local communities, where immigrants could share their heritage while learning about their new homes, where children like you could practice languages with native speakers from dozens of countries." The scope of the possibility was breathtaking. Daniel found himself imagining educational programs that went far beyond traditional language instruction to encompass cultural immersion historical understanding, and most importantly, the kind of emotional intelligence that Emma demonstrated so naturally. "But how would you ensure authenticity?" asked Maria Rossi, the Italian grandmother, who had become an integral part of the evening's spontaneous cultural exchange. "How would you prevent such places from becoming mere tourist attractions rather than genuine venues for human connection?" Emma answered before Al Mansour could respond. "By making sure that the people who run them really care about helping people understand each other, not just about making money." The simplicity of her criterion was profound in its implications. Al Mansour realized that successful implementation would require a fundamental shift in how he approached business ventures, prioritizing mission over margin, human impact over financial returns. "Emma's absolutely right," he said with growing conviction. "This can't be just another business opportunity. It has to be a commitment to using resources in service of something larger than profit." He looked around the transformed lobby, seeing not just a successful hotel space, but a preview of what the world could become if people chose connection over separation, understanding over fear, generosity over scarcity. "I want to fund this vision comprehensively, not just the initial implementation, but long-term sustainability and global expansion." The conversations that followed were unlike any business planning session Al Mansour had ever experienced. Instead of focusing primarily on financial projections and market analysis, they explored questions of social impact, cultural sensitivity, and educational methodology. Every decision was filtered through Emma's fundamental question: would this help people understand each other better? Hiroshi Tanaka contributed insights from Japanese concepts of hospitality that emphasized service to the guest's spiritual as well as physical needs. The Brazilian woman Lucia shared community-building techniques from her homeland that could create authentic cultural exchange rather than performative presentations. Hotel staff members offered practical knowledge about logistics and operations that would be essential for successful implementation. But throughout these planning discussions, Al Mansour found himself repeatedly returning to Emma's presence as a source of clarity and purpose. Her questions cut through complexity to reach essential truths. Her observations revealed possibilities that his business-trained mind might have overlooked. Her enthusiasm reminded him that the ultimate goal wasn't efficiency or scalability, but the simple joy of human beings discovering their fundamental connection to one another. "Emma," he said during a pause in the strategic conversations, "I want to ask you something very important. If I do this, if I dedicate my resources to creating these cultural bridge centers around the world, would you be willing to help me?" Emma's eyes widened with surprise and delight. "How could I help? I'm just a kid." "You're not just anything," Al Mansour replied firmly. "You're the person who started this entire transformation by having the courage to speak truth with love. You understand cultural exchange and language learning better than most adults. And most importantly, you remember what it feels like to approach the world with wonder instead of cynicism." He paused, considering how to articulate the role he was envisioning for her. "I'd like you to be our chief ambassador for cultural understanding. You would help design programs for children, test our educational methods, and most importantly, remind all of us adults when we start taking ourselves too seriously." Emma looked to her father for guidance, her young mind working to process the magnitude of what was being offered. Daniel's expression held pride, excitement, and a trace of protective concern for his daughter's well-being in such a high-profile role. "What would that mean for our regular life?" Emma asked practically. "Would I still go to school and have time to practice languages and help Papa with his work?" "It would mean your regular life becomes even more extraordinary than it already is," Al Mansour assured her. "You'd be learning constantly, meeting people from around the world, and using your gifts to help create understanding across cultural barriers." And your father would be our director of educational development, if he's interested, designing curricula that could transform how the world approaches language learning and cultural exchange. The offer hung in the air between them, representing not just professional opportunities, but the chance to turn their personal tragedy into a source of healing and hope for countless others. Daniel felt Elena's presence strongly in that moment, understanding that this was exactly the kind of work she would have encouraged, using knowledge and compassion to build bridges between people who had been taught to see each other as different or threatening. "Papa," Emma said quietly, "what do you think Mama would want us to do?" Daniel's answer came without hesitation. "I think she would want us to say yes. She always believed that education was the key to creating a more just and compassionate world. This would be her dream made manifest." Emma nodded with decision that seemed remarkable for her age, but perfectly consistent with her character. "Then yes, Mr. Al Mansour, I'll help you build places where people can learn to understand each other better." The commitment was made with characteristic simplicity, but its implications were profound. Al Mansour felt a sense of purpose and excitement that he hadn't experienced since childhood, understanding that he was about to embark on the most important work of his life. The practical arrangements that followed moved with surprising speed. Al Mansour established a foundation son with initial funding that exceeded Daniel's wildest dreams, dedicated entirely to fostering cross-cultural understanding through experiential education. The Grand Aurora became the flagship location for pilot programs that would eventually be replicated globally. Daniel found himself not just returning to academic work, but pioneering an entirely new field that combined linguistics, cultural anthropology, and social psychology. But perhaps the most beautiful transformation was the personal one that continued to unfold in Al Mansour himself. The man who had entered the lobby seeking to humiliate a janitor's daughter discovered that using his wealth to create connection rather than accumulation brought him a sense of fulfillment that no business success had ever provided. As the evening wound toward its close with new friendships formed and collaborative plans initiated, Emma found herself thinking about the story Daniel had told in Arabic hours earlier, the tale of a poor man whose gift for languages brought peace between warring kingdoms. The parallel to their own situation struck her with the clarity of recognition. "Papa," she said, and they prepared to leave the transformed lobby. "I think tonight was like one of Mama's favorite stories, the kind where something that seems bad at the beginning turns into something beautiful by the end." Daniel smiled, understanding exactly what she meant. "Yes, sweetheart. Sometimes the most wonderful journeys begin with what appears to be the worst possible circumstances." Al Mansour, overhearing their conversation, approached them with an expression that held gratitude, wonder, and something approaching reverence. "Emma, before you go, I want to tell you something." She looked up at him expectantly, her face open and curious. "When I walked into this lobby tonight, I thought I was successful because I had accumulated more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. But you've taught me that real success is measured by how much love and understanding we create in the world." His voice grew thick with emotion. "You've given me back my soul, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that gift." Emma's response was immediate and characteristically generous. "You don't have to try to be worthy, Mr. Al Mansour. You already are worthy. You just had to remember how to let people see it." She paused, then added with the wisdom that continued to amaze everyone who encountered her. "Besides, worthiness isn't something you earn by being perfect. It's something you discover by being brave enough to let people love you even when you make mistakes." The observation struck Al Mansour with the force of absolute truth. He knelt down so that he was at her eye level, understanding that he was receiving guidance from someone whose wisdom transcended age and experience. "Thank you, Emma Carter," he said simply. "Thank you for showing me what true wealth looks like." As they finally prepared to leave the Grand Aurora that night, the lobby still humming with the energy of cultural exchange and new friendships, Emma took one last look around the transformed space. Tomorrow, many of these people would return to their regular lives, but they would carry with them the memory of what was possible when human beings chose to see each other's beauty rather than their differences. "Papa," she said, as they walked toward the exit, "do you think we really changed Mr. Al Mansour's life, or do you think he changed ours?" Daniel considered the question carefully, looking back at the scene they were leaving. Al Mansour deep in animated conversation with hotel staff about implementation timelines. Maria Rossi exchanging contact information with the German couple Hiroshi Tanaka, teaching calligraphy to a group of fascinated children who had arrived with their parents for the evening's unexpected festivities. "I think," he said finally, "that the most beautiful changes happen when everyone involved becomes more themselves, not less." Mr. Al Mansour didn't become a different person tonight. He remembered who he was meant to be all along. Emma nodded with satisfaction, then surprised him with another observation. "And we didn't really change either. We were always ourselves. We just got to be ourselves in a bigger world, with more people to love and learn from." As they stepped out into the city night, father and daughter walking hand in hand toward their modest apartment that would soon be transformed by opportunities they had never dared imagine, Daniel felt Elena's presence surrounding them like a blessing. His wife's dream of using education to create understanding across cultural barriers was about to become reality on a scale that would touch lives around the world. Behind them, the Grand Aurora continued to glow with the warmth of human connection, its marble floors reflecting not just crystal chandeliers, but the light that appeared when people chose to see each other's inherent worth and beauty. And in the weeks and months that followed, that light would spread to cities around the globe as the vision born in one extraordinary evening became a movement that reminded the world of its fundamental interconnectedness. Emma fell asleep that night, whispering gratitude in Polish, the language her mother had used for lullabies and love songs. And in her dreams, she saw languages flowing like rivers between continents, carrying not just words, but understanding, compassion, and the unshakable truth that had started everything. We all belong to each other. And the greatest wealth is found not in what we accumulate for ourselves, but in what we share with every human heart that crosses our path on this beautiful, complicated, endlessly connected journey we call life. The story that had begun with laughter designed to humiliate had become a legacy of love that would echo through generations, proving once again that the smallest voices often carry the most profound truths, and that sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with a child brave enough to say, "I speak 9 languages," and wise enough to use every one of them in service of love.